Looking back, is it always a bad thing? I told you this morning that I was going to answer a question about Jesus. Did Jesus ever look back? Certainly he did. It's kind of like that question I asked this morning about it says that Jesus says that, the fox has a burrow to get, the birds, they can get them in a nest. And I don't have a place to lay my head. Is that accurate? Well, not really. Jesus had plenty of places to lay his head. Obviously, he didn't sleep standing up for 33 years. But it is accurate in the sense that he was not, I'm going to use Tim's word, he was not tethered to a place. When I was in 8th grade, I believe it was, when I was in 8th grade, I had been in 8 different schools. I knew what it was like to pull up to a desk where nobody knew you the first day of school and just kind of looking around and seeing all the little cliques and all the little people as they're talking amongst themselves and thinking to myself, will I ever make friends? Most of my time in school, we were bouncing around. Dad's a preacher, and before that, he was in the military. And so, we just were everywhere. And I knew what it was like to be in those situations where you didn't have a lot of roots. I don't really have a home place. Many of you do, and I'm glad that you do. I think it's wonderful. I kind of get, sentimental when I hear people talk about going back to their home place. I don't have one of those. I think there's an advantage to some degree. I'm not suggesting everybody needs to live this particular life, but there is an advantage to some degree in that I don't place a lot of anchors in one spot. I wouldn't like it if we had to pick up and move to someplace else tomorrow, but Cindy and I could do it. We've done it many times. It would be hard, be difficult on Gabriel, especially. Well, we could do it. I think that there's that kind of an attitude that needs to be maintained if we are going to truly do what Tim was talking about with this idea of death not really having a stinger any longer. That only happens when this world does not hold its ultimate priority for you. It's not just a neat little phrase that you can cross-stitch and put on the wall. There's a way to get there, and the way to get there is that you've got to break priorities with this physical realm. And Jesus, he kind of outlines them there, does he not? As he goes through those 3 things in Luke chapter 9. And he talks about not having a place to lay his head. He talks about not burying his dad, taking time to bury dad, and not taking time to go back and say goodbye. Some of that stuff's a little bit, it seems to me, it's just a little kind of harsh. But I have been noticing in the last year that Jesus tends to stay in that mode quite often. And we're actually this evening going to see another passage where he's in that same mode. It's a mode that people don't want to hear. They don't want to talk about it. It makes them very uncomfortable. People would unfriend him if he was on Facebook. I saw a meme recently that said that if Jeremiah and Isaiah were to preach today, nobody would hire them. I think that's true. Nobody wants to talk about the bad side of things. Nobody wants to talk about the sobering reality that in order for us to truly be effective in this world, there are radical changes that have to be made. And people who put them up on Facebook, or they talk about them from their pulpits or wherever they may be, they write the books, etc., they tend to be the enemies because nobody wants to go there. I'm reading a book called Sheep No More. It was given to me recently. Jonathan Gilliam. This guy is a Navy SEAL, worked in the FBI, really impressive fella. I'm not going to read you the whole thing. But he talks about how that it's not a religious book at all, but he's talking about how that we as people need to be alert, to be aware. And that we are really ultimately fools if we're not aware of our surroundings, especially given what's happening in our world today. There's just one little line, it's not even a full sentence, but it just caught my attention this afternoon. He says, awareness is a state of mind that most people avoid. This comes from an expert who was placed in charge of protecting people. Awareness is a state of mind that most people, they avoid. We don't want to be aware. I don't want you to call my attention to that particular area. I don't want somebody to tell me I need to change. I don't want to be challenged that I need to do better. I don't want it to be pointed out that in the past I was a failure, but if I would just simply change my ways, in the future I could be a success. I don't want you to talk about that because I don't want to be aware. It's easier for me. I do tie into what Dean was saying about this idea of atheism this morning. He's talking about it's kind of easier to be an atheist. I see that. It's a whole lot easier to dig a hole, crawl in, and just say, I'm not doing diddly, than it is to engage life and to recognize that it doesn't matter if you're 33 or 93, you still got more to learn and you still got more progress to make. That's hard, and nobody tends to want to go there. Well, when you get into John chapter 6, Jesus is talking about some more of that tough stuff. Jesus is another one of those that folks would not want in their pulpits today. because he talks about things that make people uncomfortable. And here's one of them. He's talked about this idea of eating his flesh, drinking his blood. And they don't know what to do with that. But his enemies pick up on it, and they begin to really rail against him. And it says, as you pick up in verse 60, on hearing it, many of his disciples said, "This is a hard teaching. Who can accept it?" So his enemies are picking up on this difficult stuff that Jesus is talking. You got to love me so much that you would actually eat my flesh, drink my blood. Ooh, that's difficult stuff. Talking about things that people don't like to hear. His disciples pick up on that, and they say, "Ooh, that's tough stuff. I'm not sure we want to hear it either." Aware that his disciples were grumbling, verse 61, Jesus said to them, "Does this offend you? What if the Son of Man were to ascend to where he was before? The Spirit gives life," and he goes on to talk about the Spirit and the flesh and things that Tim had actually talked about earlier on. But it's that point about, does this offend you? It's not the first time that Jesus was in that mode. Many times what Jesus had to say was offensive. A lot of times, he's not only offensive, he's poking the bear. There were times he did a miracle on the Sabbath day just to make trouble. Just so the people would watch and they'd look and they'd learn a lesson. He was willing to go there. Jesus was an abrasive Messiah because he recognized that ultimately the sting of death, the stinger of death, cannot be removed unless I remove your priorities in this realm. I told you this morning that it's not so much about looking back that Jesus is condemning. I don't think that's it. It's not the looking back, it's the priority we have placed on what is back there. That's what's really important about this lesson. Did Jesus ever look back? Yes. Let me continue in the same passage. Verse 66. From this time, many of his disciples turned back and no longer followed him. So what direction are they going? They're going back. Does Jesus know this? Yes. How does he know this? Because he turned back to see them turn back. Now, he has no intentions in following them. He's not going there, but he recognizes. He looks over his shoulder. He takes assessment. He's seen the throngs. He's seen the masses who have gathered around him. Everybody likes somebody who's going to tell you a joke or stroke the back of your head and make you feel good. Everybody likes to be around that individual who makes you feel like you're on cloud nine, but nobody likes to be around the individual who is real, that deals with the reality of life. And Jesus has just dealt with the reality of things. You can't just go to church. You can't just say you're a Christian. You can't just set a good example at work. You got to be so loyal that if Jesus says, "I need you to eat me," you'd be the first one to pull up at the table. Well, that sounds weird. But will you go there? There's a lot of things God has asked of us over the years that didn't make a bit of sense. But a handful jumped when he said jump. And at the end of the day, who survived? You think they celebrated Noah with his big boat in the backyard when nobody had ever seen a flood before? But the water comes up and the people go down. There's 8 souls left, just a handful. But who survived? God is forever asking us to take a jump, to make an investment, to go to a place that's uncomfortable, to consider a value that seems to be way outside our realm. But here's where he really looks back. Verse 66, from that time they no longer followed him. And then Jesus will say in verse 67, it's one of the saddest verses in all the Bible, "Do you want to leave me too?" Do you? Jesus asked. It's hard. You've been the most popular person. You're healing the people and providing free lunches. And they like that. That's good stuff. But all of a sudden you get into that which really counts. The stuff that removes the stinger from death. And you're not popular anymore. And Jesus says, that you want to leave too? I'm often pretty hard on Peter because he's so much like me. He was a big mouth. He just popped off. He just said what was in his head. But you know, sometimes when he said what was in his head, it was right. It was dead on. And this is one of those times. Simon Peter answered him, Lord, to whom should we go? You have the words of eternal life. We believe and know that you are the Holy One of God. That's a pretty massive statement. Jesus just said, pull up at the table and eat me. Everybody says that's just too much. And they're headed out of here. Jesus says, you going to leave too? Now think about it. That's a weird statement. And yet Peter has invested himself to the point that he will say, Lord, and I think this is implied in context, that's an odd one. That's a weird one. That's way outside my comfort zone. But who else has the words of life? Show me the plate. Pull up the chair. I think that when we recognize how important it is for us to be aware and how often we resist awareness, because I don't like talking about that. I don't want to have you bring that subject up. I don't agree with it because it's against my comfort zone. We dig a little hole, we climb back in there, and we refuse to accept that and only that which can remove the sting of death. I've never done it. I don't know. I may be completely off. And I pray that I won't disappoint you one day. But I've said it more than once from this pulpit. I am ready to go. If the Lord took me home and I got to go out to the camp tonight and speak again here in just about 30 minutes, if I have an accident between here and there and I'm gone, I beg of you to celebrate, take my little wife in, have a party, enjoy the moment, because I'm telling you as I stand here, if I'm dead the next 30 minutes, I have gone where I wanted to go. Amen. If we live that way, as Tim has said, who can touch us? No one can touch me. No one can touch you because of the great gift that Jesus has given. Now the assignment is go live that way. Don't be a Christian atheist. Live like you believe in a God who's got it. He's going to take care of these things. Break the ties, the tethers that are binding you to this world and look beyond it, because you one day will be in that box. If the Lord don't come back first, you're going there. As young as you may think you are, you're going to be there. So prioritize. Be prepared. Because it is the way of life. Death. It will happen. But it ain't got a sting. And if we can ever get there, no one can touch us.